We'll speak to a leader of reform in just a few moments. Natasha Clark is LBC's political editor. Do we have any idea of what the legal advice now commissioned by the government says?
No, and they're obviously not going to get into talking about what that legal advice says. But it's quite clear from what's happened today is this case, which I'm told was due to be heard on Thursday in the High Court, they obviously thought there's no chance we're going to win. That's exactly what's happened today. And Nigel Farage... It's fair to say this is all because of Nigel Farage taking the government to court, and they had been fighting tooth and nail. Every single government minister, from Steve Reid to Keir Starmer, had been defending this fervently for the last few months, and they had insisted that, you know, having those 4.6 million people without having those elections on those 30 councils which you mentioned, they had actually asked for those councils to be postponed. So I think there is also an element of money involved in this. Those councils clearly thought, we're going to save a bit of money by not having to run these elections. Today, the government have magically found £63 million to give to them in order to help with that. And that was one of the arguments that Steve Reid, the Housing Secretary, had made earlier this month. He was saying that's less money that we can spend on potholes, we can spend on bins. We already know how much local councils are struggling. You'll also remember that obviously lots of their debts were wiped off by the government in an announcement last week. So I don't think that those two are completely separate. You ask about Sir Keir Starmer. Now, this is 30 councils out of 136 local councils that are going to be up for grabs, 5,000 seats. Obviously, this is going to have an impact for Keir Starmer on the local elections. It's going to be more councils, and there has been analysis looked at this which shows that it's more likely that Reform are going to win some of those councils. We know that Labour are struggling in the polls. That's exactly what critics have said. That's what Nigel Farage has said. That's what the Tories have said. They said there's a political angle to this, and that is exactly the reason. Tom, I'm also told today by Reform sources, and the government basically agree, that they are now in line to pay out a six-figure sum to Reform in order to pay their legal fees for this, which does really strike to the fact of what on earth legal case were the government going to rely on if indeed it sounds like they've not been agreed, but they've been forced to pay the full costs to the Reform Party. So not only is the government now having to pay £63 million to all of these different councils in order for them to hold elections, which in the government's, in fairness to them, will be abolished in a couple of years' time, but they've also got to pay a six-figure sum to the Reform Party and to Nigel Farage. That's going to sting, isn't it?
We heard the clip from Keir Starmer there saying, well, these elections are rather meaningless because of the reforms that we're bringing into local government means that everybody's going to change in a year's time anyway, so you're not sure who you're going to be voting for. Does that argument still hold, or clearly the government doesn't believe that argument would win the day in court, so it's over?
Potentially a bit of both, but obviously the government are still saying today that they are going to be pressing ahead with their restructuring, their reorganisation of local councils. So they are still saying that that's essentially going to happen. So it is the case that we are now going to be electing councillors that might be in for a year, for 2 years, before then having to step down. Now, clearly they say on the basis of that legal advice, that is lawful, that is worth taking, and it's clear that they felt they were going to lose that and that Nigel Farage was going to be able to say, this is unlawful, we are going to win this case in court. So you say in terms of a U-turn that actually the government are getting in there first. They're saying we're going to lose this case, therefore we are going to avoid more money being racked up at the High Court, and we're going to make this decision now. That's sort of their argument today.
It's insanely bad politics.
It doesn't look good at all. At the worst it's at the best it's an embarrassing U-turn. At the worst it's you've coughed up the six-figure sum and millions of pounds of extra money.
And Nigel Farage can stand there and say, I'm on the side of democracy.
Yeah, he says today, we took this Labour government to court and won in collusion with the Tories. Keir Starmer tried to stop these people from voting. Reform is fighting for democracy. It's a really bad look for this government.
Natasha Clark is LBC's political editor. George Madgwick is the leader of Reform UK in Portsmouth. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the programme. I guess you'd be delighted by this U-turn.
Yeah, I think it's great, and it's a real result for democracy. I think the cancellation, and I will call it a cancellation, not a postponement, of elections, 3 times in 6 years now, it's absolutely shocking, and I completely welcome it. And it's an important time because, as Natasha was just saying there, we're going through a local government reorganisation phase, and that is correct. We are doing that. However, whoever runs the authorities and the councils from this May will be deciding the constitution of these new authorities. They'll be deciding who the chief executive officers are, the monitoring officers are, the chief financial officers, and these are really, really important elections. So it's been great that they've done a U-turn and people's voice will now be heard.
Although people's money will now be spent on elections which in a year's time could look, rather pointless because things change so much. How would you explain 63 million quid's worth of support for elections to people who are crying out for their potholes to be filled and for their schools to be maintained?
Yeah, I think, look, this is a list of priorities. And I think, certainly for me on a doorstep, absolutely potholes are priority, SND support is a priority, etc. However, we do get inundated with people saying that the vote is important to them. It's probably the number one issue that I've heard, to be honest. People do want to vote. They want to have their voices heard.
The number one issue you've heard on the doorstep in Portsmouth is about the cancellation of 30 local elections.
In Hampshire, absolutely, yeah, because they were obviously cancelled the mayoral elections. They cancelled the Hampshire elections last year. And what people didn't want in Hampshire specifically was a delay again, because that means that some councillors would have been on the council for 7 years after a mandate of only 4. It's wrong, Tom. It's wrong. And it's, yes, it's costing money, but for once it's being spent in the right place, in my opinion.
Talking of costing money, one county council that Reform is in charge of, in Kent, has increased council tax last week by 3.99%. Is that... I thought Reform were being elected to lower those council tax costs.
I think Reform want to lower council tax costs wherever they can. I mean, Nigel Farage himself never promised that. In Durham, more. I mean, if you look at Durham, we had great success with the recent council tax increase there. It was much below inflation. But you've got to remember, Tom, is that the council tax increase was a promise under Keir Starmer in his manifesto when he led into government. He promised that council tax would not be rising. The government would fund that. But if the government aren't funding local councils appropriately, we can't do anything but increase council taxes where we have to.
I wonder if that's going to be the same argument if Reform were to get power in Downing Street.
Let's see when we get power, hold us to account when we are. But at the moment, we haven't got the power of government. Keir has. He made a promise. He went back on it once again. And, that is now the lay and beholden of our councils. We have to make these tough decisions. Of course, we want to keep taxes lower. And in Portsmouth, as I say, I'm a leader here, and we're going to be looking at the ways that we can lower tax. Absolutely. But as I say, this comes from government funding. This is not just Labour's fault. Make no mistakes of this. You know this too well, Tom, that local government cuts started under the Conservatives and they just continued under Labour.
Appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on. George Madgwick is leader of Reform UK in Portsmouth.